brings us to our conversation this hour. I'm speaking to Professor Exen Iraki, who's an economist, and Mike Macharia, the CEO, Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on KTN Prime. I'll start with you, Macharia, from the Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers. We are hearing stories of cancellation, a very grim picture for this particular sector. What do the numbers look like at this point?
Thank you, Akisa. The numbers are horrible. We've gotten almost 100% cancellations after the announcement. So this is something that is going to really affect the industry. Just when there was a bit of hope of coming back, then we go and lock down. If you lock down Nairobi and you tell people you can't move from Nairobi to other counties, then there's really no need of any tourists visiting, because the main airport is Jomo Kenyatta. Moi International is not a hub. So it's going to be very difficult. And then back now to the domestic business, which has been sustaining us from the time we started. Then you find that people want their money back. They don't want to travel because they are unsure of what's going on. They don't know what to do with the roadblocks, where they would be. You remember after the announcement, even within the 5 counties, roadblocks popped up everywhere, and then they were removed. So it's a very, very difficult situation that we find ourselves in. It's going to lead to massive, massive job losses. And we're actually in a dire situation as we speak, Akisa.
You say things were starting to look up and there was hope. I want us you to just quickly paint a picture for our viewers. What was it like after the lockdown and there was seemingly some semblance of normalcy returning? How was it for the sector? And what do we expect now with the second lockdown?
What happened is that when we opened up, you remember we went out on very aggressive campaigns through KTB. We got some stimulus package. People started sprucing up their properties. And then we started receiving bookings, because most of our bookings are dependent on the key source markets. And if you look at a key source market like the UK, they already have a roadmap of when what happens. So, say for example, you can go for a haircut from next week after lockdown. You can have a meal in the pub mid-April. You can travel out of the country end of May. So we already started to receive bookings for the summer. In other parts of Europe, we already started getting people coming in from even markets that are not traditional, like Romania, Poland. So we were seeing the safari and beach destination starting to pick up. The meetings segment, particularly for Nairobi, was still a bit of a challenge. So we were seeing a lot of bookings coming in. And of course, then we had the school holidays, and Kenyans want to go out over Easter. You've seen that story there. Even places in Naivasha and Nakuru have cancelled. We had people that were actually on holiday when the announcement was made on Friday, and they were trying to find their way back before midnight. Then again, it was announced, you have another day to come back. But they had already cancelled their bookings and were beginning to withdraw.
Damage had been done.
We are now caught in a situation where the damage is completely done. We've had an engagement with certain agencies of the government. At some point, we were told that the people who had already reserved their safaris would still be able to come and would still be able to get to the safari destinations. But late today, we were told now there is no movement at all. So if you land in Nairobi, you stick in Nairobi.
Right.
Yet with that information, we had gone out and told people they can come. So it's all these mixed messages creating a lot of confusion.
It's a whole other conversation on how that particular communication came from the president. A lot of confusion around that. But let's bring in Professor Iraqi now as an economist. And this is one of the sectors that were immediately hit. We expect a spiral effect, not just in the 5 counties, but across the country. What did you expect to hear from the president as he was outlining these fresh directives?
In Kenyans, I think the announcement that 5 counties are going to be closed took all of us by surprise. But just like the last lockdown, we all expected that the lockdown would be tied with a stimulus package. And that is what made the last lockdown more palatable or more tolerable. But this one, nothing was announced. But we understand where the president is coming from. It's a big choice, not just for the president of Kenya, but for any other president. Is it COVID-19 or is it the economy? And it is not a yes or no balancing act, because if you open the economy does very well as it has just been peaking. But at the same time, you find people suffering from COVID-19. So I think the president just decided that, let me take this type of road. Well, then let me take this road where we are going to close the economy, then deal with the consequences. But if you remember, as Mr. Macharia said a few minutes ago, the economy was picking up. It's not just Nairobi, it's not just Naivasha and Nakuru that were picking up on tourism. Even Mombasa was full. So the economy was just picking, then it is closed. So I think the most important expectations we wanted was that we have closed the economy, but how do you caution businesses and individuals like you and me against that closing down? That is yet to come out.
Is under pressure currently to, ease the pain for a lot of Kenyans, and a lot has been said today. He has been castigated even by the political class. We saw Martha Karua speak earlier on today. Looking at the situation, KRA is clutching at anything to try and, get revenue from anything that moves, perhaps. Financial institutions had just, the moratoriums had ceased, the period of moratoriums. Is it that the president was caught between a rock and a hard place, that there was nothing to hold on to?
It's not just the KRA that is having a problem of raising enough revenues. Some of you are shareholders, and I remember one of the things that has come out in all shareholders meetings is that the dividends have either been reduced or have been postponed. There are no dividends. So the government is put in a situation where we need more revenues, but the source of revenues are dry. Because if you look at what has been happening in the last 1 year because of COVID-19, the business activities have reduced. And if business activities reduce, it logically follows that the tax revenue reduce. And maybe that's why the government is talking of borrowing, going for a Eurobond, so that to raise more revenues. So I think the government is torn between a hard rock and I would say a deep ocean. But I think we all never saw this COVID-19 coming. So the same way individuals are sacrificing is the same way the government should sacrifice. We are in it, all of us, not one of us.
Macharia, I'll come back to you and maybe just pose a question I've asked Professor on even when you were hearing the president close down or lock down 5 counties and all these other directives that have directly hit your sector. What kind of cushioning did we expect for the sector?
Akisa, we did not expect the action that was taken because this is the same action we took early last year when the pandemic hit. So what we were expecting is a different approach. And the different approach would have been an aggressive rollout of the vaccine, just like we've seen in other places. Because we now need to start mitigating the effects of COVID. We can't continue with lockdown, lockdown, lockdown. So we have now, from reports, about 1 million doses of vaccine. We still haven't hit 100,000 in people's arms. So we were expecting that to be the top priority, vaccination, Second top priority, stick to the protocols. As an industry, you remember we were the very first ones to come out with protocols last year, and we've stuck with them. There is very little infection in our places of work. When we test our staff, it's even below 1.5% turn positive. So you're actually safer in a hotel than anywhere else, possibly even safer than being in a market. So we were expecting this kind of action that would mitigate and be able to move the economy. Now, if you're going to lock down, then we need to discuss how do we treat our staff. You remember we've been keeping our staff for 1 year with not much work, but we are paying. And how are we paying? Because we are borrowing money from banks. So now we don't have revenue coming in, we'll not be able to repay those banks, and we are not able to pay the staff. So what will happen is that you have a whole host of people who are out there, out of jobs, and you have businesses that are risking shutting down. The other thing is that the nature of our business is that it requires predictability. So if I'm sitting in Russia and I want to visit Kenya, I want to know I'm coming in August or September. When the president comes and announces these measures will go on until further notice, then you can't really plan around an open-ended announcement like that. So these are some of the issues that we were thinking that would be considered. Maybe we should have had a conversation first before those announcements. And this is something that we are open to doing. We understand, like Professor says, between a hard rock and an ocean. But when you talk to people, then you find a lot more solutions than the ones that you think are appropriate when you're making the decisions on your own. We can share a lot of ideas as to how to mitigate, because we've done it before and it has worked. Now we know we can't go back to ask for more stimulus packages. The day after tomorrow, we get into April, KRA will start looking for the minimum tax that was passed against zero revenue. So we are sinking deeper and deeper in a hole. So the thing that we would want to see immediately is, first of all, the moratorium on the loans extended. We are calling for a moratorium on this minimum tax for at least 2 years so that we can be able to recover. And then we need to have a discussion as to how we are going to support our staff, because that's another area that not only will bring social issues, but also security-related problems that will come with it.
Professor, looking at this lockdown and the set of guidelines, what would be the spiraling effects that we are likely to see? Last year we saw 1.7 million job losses. What are we expecting to see in the next coming weeks or months?
I think the first prediction is that the predicted 5.2% growth rate this year is going to be limited. So we need to start revising that economic growth rate. And by extension, we are going to see less economic activities in every sector. But let's also be realistic. Although all the 5 counties have been closed down, remember those counties trade with one another. So if you are in Kiambu, you trade with somebody in Nyandaro. If you're in Kajiado, you trade with somebody in Naro. And if you are in Machakos, you probably trade with somebody in Kitui. So by crossing the 5 counties, which constitute about that 8% of the Kenya's gross domestic product, you affect the other economies, the economies of the other counties. And it's more than that. Mr. Macharia talked about Jomo Kenyatta Airport. He also talked about the port of Mombasa. You also talk about the Ugandan border, the Tanzanian border. So although you are crossing 5 counties, there is a ripple effect throughout the East African community. There's a ripple effect from one sector to another. So it is not just crossing the 5 counties. It is more than that. It is affecting everybody and every sector. So in the next few days, it is not just the hotel industry that is going to be affected. Education is going to be affected. We have seen schools like universities, students being told to go home. The people who supply food to hotels, the people who supply the basic commodities to other areas are going to be affected. So we see the crossing affected the whole supply chain, And because of the economic multiplier effect, it is going to be bigger than we think. Let's also remember that at the end of the day, when you cross 5 counties, there is always a feeling of uncertainty. And that's why I agree with my colleague here, that I wish the president had stated how long he is going to cross the counties, even if after that he extends, so that we have at least a certainty. Being open-ended really affects our investment and consumption patterns, and by extension, the whole economy. So I wish it was more certain.
So how do we get out of this? We are pretty much talking about doom for the next few weeks or few months, the uncertainty as well. But then how do we get out of this, not just as individuals, businesses, as a country? The country is broke. We're not collecting enough revenue. We're talking about a new financial year in the next 2 or 3 months. How do we build resilience?
One, Akisa, I believe that the Kenyan people are very resilient. If you look at the Kenyan economy, 83% of the Kenyans don't have formal employment. They work in the informal sector. So they are used to being resilient, working for themselves, working hard every day. So all they need is support like the ones that Mr. Macharia has brought about, moratorium on loans, maybe loan guarantees, maybe reduced VAT. We had something that we did last time during the lockdown, and there's no reason why we cannot repeat it. If you look at the US, they had one stimulus package, a second one, the third one. So there's no reason we cannot do that. Number 2, I've always advocated from day one that maybe instead of lockdown, we should have a total open up so that the economy operates 24 hours. We distribute the crowds so that instead of a supermarket being open for 8 hours, it can be open for 24 hours. So the crowd that is going to conglomerate for 8 hours is distributed. And I can assure you that if we had more consultation between the sectors, between the businessmen and all the key players in the economy, you'll be surprised by the ingenuity and the creativity and the innovativeness of the solutions people can come up with. So I think we need some wider consultation and we'll get some solutions.
Macharia, looking at the situation currently, you've talked about 100% cancellation for a lot of people, a host of employees that, a lot of owners don't know how they will pay them. Have you reached out to the government through your other channels? How are we looking at finding solutions for this as an organization?
Yeah, thank you, Akisa. We are reaching out to government. We've sent letters to the powers that be. Hopefully we'll be engaging very soon. When we went into the first lockdown, even before the president announced the measures, this came after a lot of consultations behind the scenes. We had many meetings with the CS for labor, so that we know what to do with our people. We had meetings with the CS for Treasury. We had meetings with CS for tourism. And there was a lot of engagement. By the time the president was making an announcement, everything was aligned. This time around, he just seemed to appear and make an announcement without very serious consultations. So we still believe that that door is not closed. We still would be able to consult, would still be able to put our ideas on the table. We have some fairly embarrassing situations for the country. Like now, for example, people who arrived here and started their safari and they were not due to finish it before this deadline. We were under the impression that they would be allowed to come back and go back home because international flights are still operating. So you find that you're in a situation where some people are stranded. Now we have to start looking for special permission to move them from one place to this zone here. So we still believe that there is a lot of consultation that can be undertaken. We have a lot of ideas. You remember last year when we put out the protocols, we agreed that nobody crosses Jomo Kenyatta International Airport without a PCR negative certificate. And that is happening. even up to now. So the people who are coming are holding PCR negative. So it means they're negative for COVID over the last 72 hours. We are suggesting that if we still need to move tourists within the country, particularly the domestic ones, they can be allowed to take the rapid test that is being undertaken. Results are out fairly quickly, in 10 to 15 minutes. They have a certificate, it's verifiable. It's even it can even be posted on your phone with a scan code, and you're able to move around. But simply locking people down, I don't think that will work, and I don't think it's sustainable for this industry because, first of all, 40% of our revenues goes to salaries. So we are cutting out a huge part of our obligations to the people. The second part is 25% of our revenues go to the value chain. So the person that a professor is talking about, supplier of Coca-Cola, supplier of mboga, supplier of meat. So the ripple effect is actually quite huge. So we do have some of the proposed solutions. We've reached out. We would like to have an engaging conversation with government, and we are sure that the head of state will see our side of the story. But it's just not a sustainable situation. Thanks, Akisa.
Professor, how have other countries that have been in this kind of situation like us, how have they navigated this kind of situation where you have to make a decision between lives and livelihoods, but you're also not doing very well financially?
I guess you're asking about how other countries have fared well in terms of this. We have had extreme cases like Tanzania that don't give any information about COVID-19. But we can get an example. We can learn from other examples, particularly Europe and the US and China. Because what countries have done is we started with the testing. There was a lot of testing. Then after testing, we came up with a vaccine. So every country has been rolling out a vaccine and saying that if we can vaccinate a critical number of people fast enough, then we can open the economy. That's why I agree with my friend Macharia that what probably we should be focusing on now with all the energy is how to vaccinate a critical number of people so that we stop the spread of COVID-19 and open up the economy. Number two, we should be asking, we should not even be going to other countries like this. We should be asking, how comes that Mombasa, which was at the epicenter of last time's lockdown, is doing very well? How comes that ICUs are empty in Narok? So we should not just learn from others, but also learn from the local examples. What did Mombasa do right that Nairobi has not done well? Number three, this is very important. In the last few years, our economy has become more service-based. And service industry is not easy to automate as manufacturing. And that is why this lockdown is having such a serious ripple effect, because we have very little manufacturing base. If we were doing manufacturing is easy to automate. But when you talk about service industry, in hotels, in education, and so on, they are not as easy to manufacture, or they are not as easy to automate as in manufacturing. So while we can learn from others, we can also learn from what is happening around. And number four, what lessons did we learn from the last lockdown? And I like the way Mr. Machari has put it. There are certain things we did like last time that can be applied this time. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are lessons we have learned, there are lessons we can apply now.
So then, what are these lessons that you would pick that we should have picked from the first lockdown, and we should have used it at this point as opposed to complete lockdown? Do you feel that the government is on track with how we are handling this entire COVID situation at this point?
I think if you remember what happened last time when the lockdown came, there are very clear instructions on protocols to follow, on what each person, each business is supposed to do. This time, I don't think that was really emphasized. And I think the assumption is that we can all remember what we did last time. But I guess this situation is different from last time, because by that time, there had no vaccination. This time, there are vaccination. And there's always a problem of moral hazard that since you have vaccination, people can take more risks. If your car is insured, you can drive the car very fast because it is insured. So I think although we can learn from the first lockdown, there are some variations that have come. And of course, some of the lessons we learned last time, which is very obvious, and Mr. Machari will tell you, is that after some time, people get tired of following protocols. Instead of putting mask on your face, you start putting it on your neck. Instead of sitting far from one another in hotels, people start sitting together. Instead of people sitting away from one another in matatu, they start sitting close to one another. Instead of stopping visiting your neighbors, you start visiting them. So with time, we get tired of following protocols. And that's why it's very important to keep on reminding them, keep on emphasizing them. Because human beings can get used to anything, including war. So what I'm simply saying is, in this second lockdown, if it is going to continue, let's remind people about the protocols in hotels, in transport, in meetings, and so on, so that they don't forget and they don't start taking things for granted. In the industry that Mr. Machara is talking about, he has already talked about the protocol they follow and how they work. So why don't we go back to them?
All right. I want to get a final comment. In under a minute, Machara, I want us to wrap up. What will it take to salvage this sector that continues to be battered 2 years in a row?
Akisa, let me first answer one of your questions. You said about best practices and borrowing from others. We have Rwanda, who is our neighbor, and we work very closely. If you look at the Rwanda communique, it's very specific that tourism activities will continue under strict COVID protocols. So of everything else that they've done, I think bullet M of their communique specifically indicates that tourism must continue because it's an important part of economic development. It's the same here in Kenya, but we are treating tourism as an activity that is not too important. So we can go on with everything else, but shut down tourism. We can go on with politicking, shut down tourism. We can go on with doing things in the market, shut down tourism. Now, in terms of way forward, we need a plan. And it is not difficult to develop a plan if you consult. And we can put together a solid plan. In the first lockdown, we had a solid plan. We said, shut down for this number of months, start opening with this protocol, start doing this, and we followed it. The thing that, again, to echo what Professor Iraki is saying, is that we need a sustained communication. And we've had viruses before. We've had epidemics before in Kenya. And if you look at the communication from the early 80s about HIV and AIDS, that still continues, sensitizing people on a daily basis. So we don't sensitize for 1 month or 2 months and then go back. Then when things go haywire, we call for a lockdown. We need a sustained communication strategy, but most importantly, to get out of this third wave, we need a solid plan. How many people are we going to vaccinate by the end of April, by the end of March, by the end of May? What sort of communication messages are we going to give out? Okay. And so on and so forth. So we need a solid plan and a roadmap to recovery. A solid plan and a roadmap. That's where we will wrap it up on that point. Mike Macharia is the CEO of the Kenya Association of Hotel Keepers and Caterers, as well as Professor Exen Iraki, who's an economist. We will continue with this conversation and bring you bits of it tomorrow on the front row. Thank you very much for joining us here on KTN Prime. Tough times ahead. We will continue to keep you up to speed with the latest on this end. Our sign language interpreter is Damien Evans. I am Akisa Wandera. Have a good night.